Writing Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome to Writing Out Loud. Our very special guest today is Pulitzer-winning journalist Timothy Egan. Thank you so much for being here, Timothy.
Hi, Teresa. Great to be with you this morning.
You are one of the contributors to the New York Times Pulitzer-winning series, How Race is Lived in America. That was in 2001. As we celebrate Black History Month, are there any postscripts you would like to add?
Well, it was a real fascinating series because they asked us to go deep, to go beyond the surface. And that's why it's called How Races Live, because there's two conversations. There's the surface conversation we have about race, in which we all know our role and all know our codes. And then there's another conversation that's much more below the line. Now, my task was to go to an African-American politician and an Asian-American politician. We then had the first Chinese-American governor ever in Washington State, and asked them what it's like to wear the face of both a politician and their race. And so it was a really, it was like putting them on the couch. I mean, like a psychologist, so I felt like I kept going back and going, I need more, I want a little deeper. And it's really hard to do because politicians are so trained to speak in superficial ways. I'll tell you one story though. The African-American, a guy named Ron Sims, who was the executive of this big county, told me, it was very personal stuff, very personal after a while. And I said, you know, I'm not so sure I want this to run because it's going to expose you. And he goes, no, all my life I've asked for people, I've waited for people to ask me these questions. That people always talk to him about policy and transportation and the issues of municipal government, but no one ever talked to him about that personal side. And so I saw him the other day and he said, I feel wonderful about that series. My mother cried when she read it because someone actually went deep, you know, went below the mask.
That's lovely, really, the way that you put that. Now we have an African-American president, so have we made good progress?
It's really hard to say. I mean, President Obama tried to take race off the table and become sort of a race-neutral president. And boy, I can't, it's such a generalizing thing. You can't really say whether we've made, I mean, sure, historically, of course, a nation that had slavery, not certainly written into the Constitution, but blacks were considered 3/5 of a person for the purpose of a census. That's in the Constitution. To go from there to an African-American president, no one can deny that great arc of history. And Martin Luther King said the arc of justice always rises. No one can deny that, but it's hard to say whether we've made that much progress. There are still a lot of incidents.
Your book, The Worst Hard Time, very close to us here in Oklahoma. What was it about the great American Dust Bowl that called out to you as a journalist? I mean, you're son of the Pacific Northwest.
Right, I am. I'm from a place where it rains a lot and it's green and there are mountains, and I come down here and it's flat and it's brown, and I'm kind of, wow, I feel like I'm one of those British explorers that goes somewhere and feels out of sorts. I'll tell you, I was the accidental Dust Bowl historian because I was working on a series about the emptying out of small town America. All these counties in the Western Plains that have less people now than they had 100 years ago. You can go down this huge swath of the midsection of the United States and it's empty. And it used to have people because we were a farming nation. Now less than 1% of us work the land, so there's no reason for these small towns in the Western Prairie to exist. They're almost ghost towns. Most of them will be gone 10, 15 years. They're dying now. I was going from town to town hearing the same story about collapse and loss and banks closing and schools closing. And then inevitably I would close my notebook and some elderly person would say, but that's not the story of what happened here. I said, what is the story? And they'd say, it's what happened in the dirty 30s. And my conception of the Dust Bowl was, like most Americans, the John Steinbeck story, the grapes of wrath, that everyone left. But the historical fact, and that's why it's so important to Oklahoma, is that everyone did not leave. 2/3 of the people living through the worst environmental disaster, social disaster, economic disaster, something that's unfathomable in our time, an age before Social Security, an age when the sky turned black at noon, an age when people ate brined tumbleweed to stay alive, when whole towns would telegraph to Washington, we're starving. That was within our lifetime, and there were people that had the story still. So that was my jumping off point, to get that story before it slipped away.
Give us a sense of the kind of research you did.
I'm a great believer in history and journalism by walking around and absorbing it, firsthand information. There's scholars who go deep into the research, and I certainly did some of that, but there's no replacement for the tactile, talking to someone, experiencing the region, knowing what it's like on a cold day or when a blue norther comes down. So I really fully immersed myself in the region, and I would gather folks in a room such as this, probably 8 to a dozen people in their 90s, because remember, this thing happened 70, 80 years ago. So if you saw it when you were 20, you're 97 now or something like that. But at the time they were in their 80s and 90s, and I would gather them in a room and just hear their stories. And after a while, they just started pouring out.
Did you make any discoveries that surprised you at all?
I'll tell you the takeaway point I had in the discovery realm. We, rightly so, tend to complain about a lot of stuff in our age, but it's relatively minor by perspective. We went through a terrible recession, and I won't try to downplay anyone who lost a job or suffered a financial hit, but it can't compare to going back to almost a subsistence level of living, where you are just scraping raw to live, and you don't know what the next day is going to bring you. So my discovery was actually a hopeful thing, this sense of resilience, that human beings can take so much and still come out the other end feeling somewhat positive about it. So I was really impressed by the survivors and their hopefulness and their resilience. Now, they called them tomorrow people. That was one of the words they had, because that was the only thing they had in the bank was tomorrow. The possibility that things would get better.
Was there a turning point in your research, maybe someone you met that made this history more personal for you?
I had a lot of women, because women outlive the men, and women are better storytellers. And men tend to be bottled up and emotional, and you wouldn't understand. And I found a man who was in his 90s, a guy named Ike Osteen, who lived in southeast Colorado, and he grew up with a family of 9 in a sod house with an earthen floor. And Ike went off to World War II, landed on the beaches of Normandy at D-Day, and he had this marvelous perspective of the 20th century. I mean, I asked him what was worse, fighting the Nazis on D-Day, or surviving his hometown during the Dust Bowl, and guess which one he said? Dust Bowl, because he said the randomness of it. He lost several of his classmates, 16, 17-year-old kids, sitting next to him in class, otherwise healthy guys, and a couple days later they're coughing up and they're dead of what was called dust pneumonia, which is a form of silicosis. And so they had these triage hospitals. So when I found Ike, it was sort of a turning point for me, because I was able to put the story, I wanted to balance it, and more through perspective of a man, and also someone who had started in one of these earthen floored sod houses. It was actually a dugout, which I don't know if you're familiar with the term, but a lot of these people lived in what was called dugout, because it was dug 4 feet into the ground. That was your bottom of your house, and then the other 4 feet were above. It was mainly a way to stay out of the wind. But an earthen floored place, and then seeing the arc of the 20th century. So that was a good turning point for me.
How closely did you work with Ken Burns on his film about the Dust Bowl?
I worked quite a bit with Ken Burns, and I was very impressed with his approach to the story. He tries to get it right. He, like me, is a great believer in voices and tactile stuff, and getting the texture of a story as opposed to an academic version, or it's important to get the overarching story, but Ken also believes in getting the details, and it was a wonderful experience. I was a little leery at first, because he's Ken Burns, and you wonder what he's going to do with the story that you spent so much time unearthing, but he did a masterful job, and it's been great to see the story get out to people. We almost lost the story. The way we look at history is someone gets the first take, and that becomes the version. And sometimes the first version is it's incorrect, but it's not the whole story. So now we know through Ken's documentary, and to a lesser extent my book, that there was a big, huge, important chapter of American history, our story that happened in this state and this region, and now most of the country has incorporated it into their school books, and kids are actually learning the lessons of this.
When you write a book like this, Timothy, does it cause you to view your own life any differently?
It does. You know, I'm Irish American, so I come from a storytelling people. And we couldn't live without, you know, somewhat mythologizing our background and our history and our life of our currency of misery, and the things that make Irish Irish. So I come from a storytelling background, but when I do something like this, I do look at my own life and try to wonder, you know, my certain place now living in 2014, you know, what's the perspective of our people and how will someone, I do always wonder, because that's when you do history, all you do is time travel. You immerse yourself in another age. Deep immersion. What clothes did they wear? What food did they eat? Did they date? What do they do for their entertainment? What time did they go to bed? What was it like in their house on a really cold day, but your walls are papered with newspapers, which is what I remember people telling me that was the only insulation in some of their houses. And they were reading the funny papers, you know, inside their house on a day where it was 10 below and the wind would just be leaking through. So it's caused me to look, time capsule my own life in some ways.
Yeah. What do you think are the most important lessons that we need to think about when we think about the Dust Bowl era?
That's a great question, and I think the first and most important one is about climate change. Now, there's a consensus view that human beings have changed the climate, that CO2 is out there now, but there are some doubters, and there's people who say, you know, it's not true, man can't change the earth. Well, in the Dust Bowl, if you want to look at it as almost a parable, we did change the earth. We changed, we were a force of awful geology. We took an area about the size of Pennsylvania, that's how much, and ruined it. And some of it's been restored, much of it's been restored. And this wasn't my perspective. These were the folks who lived through it who said that. They knew they screwed up. They knew they'd pushed nature. So there's a story and a lesson about pushing nature too hard, and that people can change the earth and change it for the worse. I mean, they stripped this greatest grassland the world had ever seen upside down, and it took to the sky. It's no more complicated than that. That's the first lesson. The human lesson is a hopeful one, and I mentioned it earlier about resilience.
Yes.
You can take these hits, unimaginable hits, and still come through the other side. Now, that's not to say there weren't, you know, suicide spiked during this time. For the first time in our history, the birth rate actually went down. People stopped having babies. They didn't. There were a lot of people didn't. I mentioned tomorrow people. There were a lot of people who had no hope for tomorrow. So I don't want to sugarcoat it. It was the worst hard time.
What themes from the worst hard time carry over into your book, The Big Burn?
Well, there was in both those stories, The Big Burn is a story of the largest wildfire in American history. And this summer, I think we're going to see something that may eclipse it, because we've had a terrible drought throughout most of the West. And the forests of the West are just tinder dry right now. And they will be awful starting in the spring. So on one scale, it's a story of just a fire that burned an area the size of Connecticut in a weekend. 3 million acres gone in actually less than a weekend, 36 hours. We've never had a fire on that scale before. So on one thing, it's a story of you know, a catastrophic natural event, but it's also the emergence of an American conservation ethic. So what came out of that was a great president, Teddy Roosevelt, who used that, as great presidents can, as a rallying cry to save the United States Forest Service and say, you know, we have to look after tomorrow. We have to look after our resources.
USA Today called the fire the Katrina of its day, and you might put this in a historical context for us. Give us the year of the fire.
The fire happened in 1910, and we had never tried to fight a wildfire before. I didn't realize that. I always thought we always did. As I said, there was nothing bigger, has been nothing larger since. 5 towns were burned as well, in addition to these 3 million acres. And it was the Katrina in the sense that the world's eyes were on a natural disaster. It was the first time a wildfire was covered by the global press. There were correspondents from Europe, Washington, D.C., New York, etc. And people came from all over to fight. Most of them were immigrants. They were Irish, Italian, Polish, they were African American, Buffalo Soldiers sent up. We didn't know what we were doing, because they had no idea how to fight a fire either. And that's why there was a lot of tragedy. A lot of people died in that event. But what came out of it was sort of a misguided thing in the sense that thereafter they vowed to stop every wildfire on National Forest Service land. Well, that was somewhat of a misguided policy because fire is part of nature. And so you have, some fires have to burn in order for forests to regenerate. So you had a lot of buildup of fuel.
Your latest book is Short Nights of the Shadow Catcher. Tell us about this wonderful, wonderful photographer, Edward Curtis.
Yeah, thank you for bringing it up. Curtis created a masterpiece. He set out in 1900, the dawn of the 20th century, to document every Native American tribe still living somewhat by the old ways. He didn't know how long it would take him. He didn't know how many there were. He thought maybe it would take 5 years. It consumed the rest of his life, 30 years. He documented 80 tribes, took more than 40,000 photographs, many of which you have here in Oklahoma at the Gilcrease Museum and places like that. And it's a masterpiece. It is the greatest photographic achievement of our time, not just in American history, arguably in world history. Matthew Brady's Civil War pictures were great, but they can't come close to the magnitude of what this one man with a 6th grade education did. They called him the Shadow Catcher, and that's why I called the book Short Nights of the Shadow Catcher. The legacy of it is that the tribes themselves really appreciate him. He not only documented and took pictures of faces. When you go to an Indian reservation in this country, you will see a Curtis picture because someone will say, "There's my grandfather." I look into that face and I can see my blood. More importantly, though, he took this little audio recorder with him. So he recorded, in some cases, the last person to speak the language. So when the tribes went to revive their language 5-10 years ago, here were these incredibly valuable time capsules of this guy who'd gone around with this little wax audio cylinder. And I was so impressed by the magnitude of his achievement that one man with a 6th grade education could do what has been called not just the greatest photographic achievement, but the greatest anthropological achievement, because he documented their creation myths. Where'd you come from? Their, what they ate, how they lived, their religion, and their language, and their songs. So I was just so impressed by the magnitude of it. And that's the story I try to tell, is of a lone man's achievement, knowing nothing about Indians when he started out.
He was this detached observer, but then there was this transformation. What worked together to bring about this transformation?
Yeah, that's a great point. And by the time he got to Oklahoma, he was a fully involved advocate for Indian citizenship. As you know, Native Americans didn't get the right to become full American citizenship, vote, et cetera, until I think it was the 1934 Native American Citizenship Act. By then, Curtis was going around speaking on behalf of, let's bring these people into the full spectrum. They're citizens. They've been here before us. Let's let them vote. Let's let them be part of what we are. We let every immigrant become a citizen, but these people who've been here for thousands of years can't have any rights. But he started out as somewhat of a dandy. He's a good-looking guy. Saw Indians as a commodity. He thought this was a way to become famous, and he did become famous. I'd say he was like the Annie Leibovitz of his time, because he was the portrait photographer of the stars. And Teddy Roosevelt's daughter Alice was this sort of wild child. Roosevelt famously said, "I can be president of the United States, or I can be a father to Alice, but I can't possibly be both." And so when she got married, it was a big deal, celebrity deal. And who did they pick to take her wedding pictures? Edward Curtis. So he could have just been this famous, semi-superficial celebrity photographer, because his book was backed up. Every woman of glamour wanted her picture taken by him. He chucked all that to pursue the obsession, became an obsession, of documenting Native people. Never made a dime off it. Lost his copyright. Now a single copy of his magnum opus, The North American Indian, one sold at auction for $2 million. So they're very valuable from a financial perspective, but they're valuable as cultural achievement. And in the story of the artist, he dies alone, broke, having lost everything. It's a sad story in the end. It's a wonderful achievement. And he was sort of the Indiana Jones of his time too, because he dashed around. He was a good-looking 6'4" guy with his fedora, and I kept imagining the character Indiana Jones, because this guy would go down the Grand Canyon on the Columbia River, and all over the West and up north, and just sort of dashing from place to place with his 14 by 10 inch camera. Imagine, we have everything now with our palm of our hand with our cell phones. Every picture he took, he had to take a glass plate about the size of a piece of computer paper and put it in his camera. And then he would put it in his backpack and schlep down the mountain or down the river wherever to get that glass plate home.
He died in 1952. If you could interview him today, what would you want to ask him?
Oh boy, there's so many things I'd want to ask him.
I bet.
One of the interesting side notes, his brother was a photographer as well, but they stopped speaking for 30 years. They never spoke to each other the last 30 years of their life. Supposedly that was over a financial deal that went bad, but I interviewed Curtis's surviving grandson, who was 81 years old and living in Port Townsend, Washington. He said he thinks it was over a woman.
Oh,
so
well.
I want to ask him that. Also, I wanted to ask him, what it was like to be an intimate of Geronimo, Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce, Teddy Roosevelt. He knew every famous person, Indian and non-Indian, of his time, though he died obscure. He took the last real portrait of Chief Joseph, who was considered the Indian Napoleon. Every native figure of any prominence who was alive, he took their picture. So I'd want to ask him, what were those people like? What did you learn from them?
You've seen so many things through your histories, through all of your work. What is it that keeps motivating you as a journalist, that keeps speaking to you and saying, hey, Timothy, here is another subject you need to follow? It's
the storytelling instinct, I think. You can't ever let the curiosity in you die. And I'm just a storyteller. I mean, sometimes people always use you as well, call me a historian. Well, there are historians with PhDs who know more about an individual issue, certainly than I, but I'm a storyteller, and as long as there are untold stories, I'll be driven. And believe me, there are lots of untold stories. I came here, just being in Oklahoma for a day or two, I heard 3 or 4 things I'd never heard before that I thought, wow, might be something there.
Do you see any overlapping characteristics between you and Curtis?
Well, that's a flattering question, but yes, I did. And the main one is, and you got familiar with this as a Westerner, Curtis felt that he was disrespected by the East, that they didn't get him. Though, the New York Times did page 1 stories on him, famous Indian photographer, goes to White House was the headline in the Washington Post when he took one of his native friends to meet Roosevelt in the last days of his presidency. But yeah, there's the parallel is that Curtis did not get the support of the Smithsonian, which is America's attic. I mean, they're the people who gather all our great artifacts and everything, because they didn't feel he was educated enough, that they have, at one point, someone said to him, we have Indian experts, some of them have even met Indians. And he knew more about Indians than anyone. He knew their languages, he knew them intimately, and yet he felt really disrespected because he had that 6th grade education. He's a self-taught man, and he was a Westerner. We both are from the Pacific Northwest. We're both Westerners, and I've felt most of my life that there is an East Coast bias, that too much of our culture is filtered through the East Coast. So I've tried to tell Western stories.
And in some ways, aren't you too documenting vanishing Americans?
I think so. I get things just before they slip away. Certainly in the Dust Bowl, these people who lived through that will all be gone in 10 years' time. And with them goes their story, our story. So I certainly feel like that.
When you spend so much time working on a book like this, is it hard for you to let it go?
It is, because someone told me a long time ago that the way to write a great book is to live the dream. In other words, so throw yourself into it. When you're in a dream and then you wake up, it's interrupted, you can't get back into it. You know how that is.
Yes, yes.
I don't let myself get interrupted. I try to stay full. I'm in 1910. I'm in 1932. I'm now working on a book about an Irish American. The story starts in 1848. I'm trying to put myself in 1848 and imagine these Irish immigrants coming to New York City, waves and waves of them, these coffin ships, they called them, these tiny little immigration ships where a lot of them would get sick or die. You have to live that dream. And so when I'm researching and writing, I have to snap out of it because, okay, get back in the 21st century. It's 2014 now. And I also write a column for the New York Times, which gives me a way to pull myself out of the history.
Opinionator,
right,
yes.
exactly, and get comment on contemporary issues.
Yeah. What kind of feedback do you get on your column?
Generally pretty good. I try to write it from a Western perspective. It's a different task than writing a book, certainly.
No, yeah.
With an opinion column, you're trying to be provocative. And sometimes I'll say things that I don't, maybe don't entirely believe, but I'm just trying to stir opinion. I'm trying to stir a conversation. We have this wonderful free speech society, and I'm just trying to be a free speech agitator and get some conversation going, get some perspective going on certain issues. And so that's a lot. It's actually fun. I don't pay that much attention to the reaction, because if you did, you would probably self-censor yourself.
How good have you gotten at gauging the response you're going to receive?
I can usually tell if now that's a hard thing to quantify, but I can usually tell when something's going to go, it's going to be real hot button. What's amazing is that people, I wrote a story, I wrote an opinion piece once. I was here in Oklahoma, and I was at the Nature Conservancy's Open Prairie Reserve, and I talked about, in this piece, about how touched someone who comes from a land of mountains and forests, and really, you could see 3 national parks from where I live in downtown Seattle, how I always thought the prairie was sort of, pedestrian landscape, and how touched I was by seeing a piece of the original prairie, seeing buffalo there. There are buffalo on that, bison on that Nature Conservancy range, seeing the wildflowers glow in the wind, seeing that great color. And that piece went ballistic. Everyone read it. It was the most read piece for about a week. That I didn't anticipate.
Timothy, it's been so nice having you with us today. Thank you. And thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.